Well, tonight we're concluding, obviously, our study of the first 11 chapters of Genesis, which is the story of God as creator and the story of humanity, his creation. And it's been given to us in a very patterned and poetic means, hasn't it? We see that this is not just mere history, it's definitely not mythology, but it is theological storytelling. And since it's been a 3-month-long process for us, I'm going to very briefly review just the major beats, some of the things that we've thought about, just to bring that up in our mind before we finish off tonight. So in Genesis 1 and 2, we get the story of creation told from almost paradoxically different but mirrored perspectives. First and foremost, we see that story, or those stories, I should say, are about God and how God brings the unformed and unordered world from chaos into purpose. He conquers both the abyss waters in chapter 1, and in chapter 2, he conquers the lifeless desert. And at the pinnacle of all of his creation are not the stars, not the trees, not the mountains, not the animals, but humanity. Male and female, the images of God. They are the pinnacle of his creation. And so he gives two particular characters, one male, one female, Adam and Eve, the name meaning humanity and the name meaning life. He gives them the right to dominion over the earth, to be like him, to be a ruler over the realm in which he gives them. And so they are to rule, to be fruitful and multiply. And God gives them only one rule or standard to live by. There's no 10 commandments here. He simply says, don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. In other words, trust in my wisdom. Trust that I know what's good and what's bad, and follow after me. Don't try to pursue it yourself. Well, we know that sets up where everything goes wrong, because in Genesis 3, we have this mysterious evil figure appear out of nowhere. The background on the life and the origin of Satan are mysterious and kind of shrouded in mist in the Old Testament. But here comes this devilish figure in the form of a serpent, a dragon-like deceiver. And he lures man and woman into rebelling against God, into choosing their own path, their own wisdom, instead of God's wisdom. And that mistake that they make, that sin that they commit, sends them down a path of further sin and death. And we have followed in their wake ever since, haven't we? That's all the problems that we can see in the human history and society today, is that we're following after our own wisdom. We say what's right, and what's wise, and what's good, and it's so often, more often than not, is not that way. And so for this, transgression is the word I'm looking for this sin and death as the curse enter the world. And God says that this is not only going to affect his creations, or not only going to affect man and woman, but it's going to affect the rest of creation too. Creation is cursed. And so this is where the tension comes into the story. Now, humanity has royally messed all of this up. There should be no way to go back, because God says, if you do this, you'll die. And game over. Life is ended. But strangely, when humanity does this, God doesn't kill Adam and Eve. Instead, he prolongs their death and sets up a reason for them to hope, showing that all is not lost in their life. And for us that are looking at this, gives us hope that all is not lost, even when we've made the most catastrophic errors in our life. And so God promises that their descendant will come not only to defeat the serpent, but he will come also to defeat the serpent's weapons, namely sin and hell and death. And so a new pattern is set, where we're on the lookout for a Messiah figure that will bring humanity back into the garden, so to speak, out of sin and back into God's good graces and presence. That's the narrative arc that we're now on. And so Eve hopes that person will be this son that she has. With God's help, I've gotten man and I've named him Cain. But we know the story of humanity's new hope and would-be savior ends tragically, because he doubles down on the sin of his parents And he too is deceived, not by a snake, but the beast crouching at his door, which is sin. And he ends up killing his brother Abel in pride and anger. And so God curses Cain to a life of wandering. But again, Cain defies God. And this probably comes from a place of fear and dread and anxiety, but also pride. He settles down in the east, a direction that is showing that he's moving away from God, God's plan. He settles down with an unknown wife, and there he builds the first city. So he's not spreading out on the earth, he's not wandering, but he builds this city, which gives rise to a culture of unceasing evil. And so God establishes, instead of Cain, since Abel is quite literally a dead end, and Cain is a disaster and cursed, God raises up a new man, Abel. Well, maybe he'll be the Messiah. Well, he's not the Messiah, but his line is one that the scriptures say are a people that call upon the name of the Lord. So there's worship that's established through Abel's line. That's a good and promising note. But eventually, here's where the tension comes back in. The pride of Cain infects the people of Seth, and the sons of God, some mysterious spiritual beings, I believe, intermingle with the daughters of man. How that works biologically, physically, historically, I'm not sure. I'm not sure anybody really is. But it creates this mighty warrior class of almost demonic proportions. This is where the first mega cultures and empires come out of. And the earth is so corrupted and polluted by sin that God in his sorrow seeks to just cut it off at the source by decreating the world. He created the world by bringing it out of a flood, and now he's letting the flood come crashing back down on the world, essentially decreating, uncreating the world. But again, he chooses a descendant of Adam to be, hopefully, the messianic hope. That's what we might be feeling in the story. So he chooses this righteous man, Noah, and his family to build an ark. And he takes with him all of the animals and seeds he needs to come out of God's judgment and go into a new world, a new paradise, and start the world over again. So again, we should be primed for hope. And so an unprecedented catastrophic flood destroys the ancient world, but God is faithful to see his chosen man and his family through this 40 days and nights of judgment. And finally, after a year in the ark, when Noah emerges, he emerges to a new Eden, and he's the new Adam. He goes and plants a garden. But then we see again that the problem of sin has not been totally washed away, because he goes and he plants a vineyard and he makes wine and he gets drunk off his wine. And his own son, Ham, takes advantage of his vulnerable state to shame him for sure and possibly assault his mother. One interpretation of that text. And so this new world is just like the old one. There's no messiahs here. And so we are just up and down, mountains and valleys the whole way. The trauma and the drama of Scripture is unbelievable. But the line does continue from Noah and from rather his sons, Shem and Japheth, who are not cursed like Cain was or like Canaan, Shem's or Ham's son, would be. But we read about, and this is what we talked about a couple weeks ago when we last met, the people that come out of Noah's family. We get a table of nations, 70 people. That's not the complete portrait of every nation that would ever exist, but it gives a holistic picture of the known ancient world, and it shows us a broad humanity that God has spread to the ends of the earth. And so we get, again, that God's poetic pattern for salvation. You know, he said, in the very beginning, be fruitful and multiply. And even though humanity has sinned and resisted him at every point, look, they've been fruitful and they've multiplied and they've spread out. But we get to the final temptation, the final rebellion of the human race tonight. And it's when the human race, all these different people groups in toto, collude to surpass God. And they do so by wanting to become his rival. So essentially they're committing the sin of Adam and Eve again, but on an exponential or astronomical scale. They want to build a tower, or really a ziggurat, which is like a temple. They want to build this religious temple into the sky and supplant God out of his own residence. So again, in their ancient cosmological way of thinking, they can literally build something that goes into God's front yard and kick him out of his house where they get to live, and God is, scattered to the winds. That's what they're planning to do, where they can make a name for themselves. So not only have they doubled or quadrupled, but they have octupled down on the sin of Adam and Eve. God has been gracious and merciful, and humanity just keeps repaying him by getting worse. It's astounding. And all the threads of our patterns and poetic flourishes get knotted up here. And so this leads me to this conclusion. Perhaps there is no more accurate mirror, I think, that we can hold up to ourselves today than that of Genesis 11. If you want to see a portrait of humanity as it actually is, in its heart, you can look to this chapter. The perils of the Babylonian heart, we might call it, take up residence in us today. And so the English poet Francis Thompson's verse goes, "And all man's Babylons strive but to impart the grandeurs of his Babylonian heart." So it doesn't matter if you're Indian or Chinese or Mexican or American or British or Greek or Japanese, any culture has within it a Babylonian heart where they are trying to set up the world as it will reflect them so they can make their image bearers and leave their mark. And so, as Kent Hughes points out, history demonstrates that the Babylonian heart is endemic to humanity. The problem of sin is not only cultural and systemic, but it's even worse than that. It's personal. It's internalized. Centuries after the fiasco of Babel or Babylon, we might call it, Nebuchadnezzar, we read in Daniel 4:30, strode over the ramparts of his royal palace and declared, "Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty?" He's talking like a god. That's Nebuchadnezzar. And centuries later, King Herod, from a totally different people group, is talking just like this. He's decked out in his royal robes, and he's addressing his people in the book of Acts, chapter 12, and they shouted, "The voice of a god and not a man." And then he's eaten by worms shortly thereafter. But this is the litany of the Babylonian heart, and it rolls so easily from the human lips. Alexander the Great wept, for there were no more worlds to conquer. That's from, most famously from the movie Die Hard, is where you get that line. But there's some classical precedent that is slipping my mind right now. And then there's Caesar Augustus. And when he died, some feared that God himself had died. Or then there's Louis XIV, who was called the Sun King. He was so extravagant in his wealth and his glory. And then there was Joseph Stalin, who encouraged those who were weary and labor and fatigued in their battles to, when they grew weary, to think of him so that they would grow strong in heart again. See, we do not need history, however, to understand this sort of action. Because when we look in our own lives and hearts, we can see that we too have an imperial self, as Kent Hughes calls it. Our tendency is that we set ourselves up likewise as many potentates to exalt our little Babylonian hearts to the thrones of our lives. The only difference between us and whoever is in the White House, whether a Republican or Democrat or an independent or anybody else, is that we don't have access to that kind of money and power. That's the only thing that separates us from them on a human level. And so here's the question that this chapter seeks to answer, spiritually speaking. What does God think of this impulse in humanity? And how does he handle it? And what is this story all about? So let's now finally, after this big 15-minute preface, get into the text itself. Well, chapter 11 opens with some information that takes us a step back in time. We read that the known world, the whole world, spoke the same language and had the same vocabulary. Now, last time, when we were in Genesis chapter 10, we saw these 70 different people groups that came from the sons of Noah, from Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and where they went all over the Mediterranean world. Some went north and south and east and west. Some were by the coast, some were by the mountains. Some made iron, some lived in huts. I mean, that's, we get all the sort of classification of people. But each were described as having their own culture and nation, and most importantly, language. So, what that means is that the event of this chapter, both logically and chronologically, has to occur before chapter 10. So in other words, if you wanted to have a chronological Bible, you would shift chapter 10 and 11 to tell the historical character. But remember, the Bible's not interested in mere history. It's interested in theological truth. And so the arrangement, obviously, is telling a story. So what is the Spirit telling us through Moses' particular composition and switching of these chapters? Well, I think it shows us that this project was doomed before it even got underway. These people were already, they might as well have been in different parts of the world with different languages and cultures. That's how much hope they had of supplanting God. I think there's a little bit of polemical writing going on here. That's a fancy word in theology and philosophy. Polemical is when it's sort of aggravated and antagonistic towards the audience that it's addressed. So I think Moses is kind of rubbing the pagan's face in it here. But verse 2 gives us another ominous detail. It says that these people that have come together and collected have migrated from the east. So again, that is the direction that Adam and Eve were driven after the rebellion in the garden. And that was where Cain was exiled to when he built the first city that became corrupt and evil. Where the Nephilim and Nimrod terrorized the people, that was in the east. Where the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians lived, the great latter-day enemies of the nation of Israel, the ancient nation of Israel, not the modern nation-state of Israel. It's not the same thing. Those people are from the east too. And so later in Genesis, we'll see that Lot and Jacob and others will go eastward and often into trouble. When Lot goes east, that's when he gets into Sodom and Gomorrah, and there's a mess there. When Jacob goes east, it's because he's running from Esau, who wants to kill him. And he gets into all sorts of devilish things out there. So the people moving from the east back towards the west is showing, again, I think theologically, that evil is encroaching on the situation. Then another disturbing declaration is made, verse 3. They said to each other, "Come, let's make oven-fired bricks." Now, to us, that sounds like, okay, that's just one random detail that we have. But a couple of things to note here. First is that they are engineering, to our knowledge, they're engineering a new technology, but to a disastrous effect. This is the first time we're given sort of a pattern or a schematic for how things are built. They're conspiring to engineer this new structure unlike anything that's been done, at least in the biblical story. Certainly there are people that have come up with strategies for making buildings that, again, historically preceded this, but the first time in the biblical narrative that we see that they've done this. And the irony is that this is supposed to be a place of worship, and it's a place that will just bring disaster. So, for instance, it reminds me of the Nobel Peace Prize. I'm sure you've all heard this story, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself here. It's named after Alfred Nobel, a Swedish engineer and inventor and scientist, who ironically invented dynamite as a construction tool, to help demolition and clearing out things that would replace sort of the unwieldy nature of black gunpowder that people were using. Dynamite was more of a controlled explosion. He created it to use in the process of building stuff up. But dynamite's primary use throughout human history is to become one of the most deadly weapons to ever be deployed, especially in the modern day. And so here's the man that we named the Nobel Peace, the Peace Prize after, a man who's solely and singularly responsible for the death of untold millions with his invention. That's kind of the irony we're supposed to be getting, I think, with the Babylonians building brick and mortar. Humanity has a way of using their God-given image to create things that should be good, but warp them for evil purposes. I mean, we see this all the time with the technology we create. As soon as any sort of new advancement comes about, whether it's the printing press or the internet, one of the first things, this is shocking to me, but historically, one of the first things that is used in new forms of mass communication is essentially to invent pornography. Verbal or pictorial pornography. So again, it takes this thing where we should gain knowledge and it feeds into the lust of the human flesh. It's an astounding reality. But there's another component of this. Second, we see some foreshadowing here. Do you remember when Israel was in Egypt as slaves in those first few chapters in Exodus? They too were making bricks, we read. And so they used stone and mortar instead of these bricks and asphalt, as we read here. But they were worked to death building up Egypt's evil empire. And so we get the association here that those who, in the Bible, that make their people, and we kind of get this even with Solomon's reign a little bit, force heavy labor on their people, are setting themselves up for a divided and fallen empire. And so those who elevate themselves and their culture by enslaving and oppressing others outside of it are doomed to be enemies with God. So that's some of the symbolism I think we should be getting out of this. And finally, their evil purpose is made patently clear in verse 4. And they said, "Come, let's build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky. Let's make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we'll be scattered throughout the earth." So in direct opposition to the divine mandate, humanity colludes to build a city, and God told them to spread out. That's bad enough. And within it, a tower, again, or a ziggurat. They're not building a World Trade Center, so to speak, just a big skyscraper. They're building one of these, tiered religious buildings that you might see, like in a place like Egypt, or, those ancient, I think, are they Mayan or Aztec temples? I don't even know. I should know that. But those big things that lead up to the sky with many steps. That's what they're building, the biggest one the world had ever seen up until that point. And they want to reach, again, God's realm. They want to get up into the sky. Now, little did they know that as they continued to build, they would, even if they built it 30 miles high, they still wouldn't get to the end of, barely outside of the Earth's atmosphere. So it's an impossible task that they're undertaking, but the pride is still there. And they want to make a name for themselves. Now, this too is ominous because the Nephilim of old, we read, were the mighty men who were men of renown, or literally the Hebrew renders it, the men of name. And so they're just like these evil characters that we meet in Genesis 6. So instead of scattering throughout the world and praising the Lord and glorifying his name, they're doing everything in reverse. Everything God has commanded, they're doing exactly the opposite of it. And so the stage is set. This is the most concentrated and organized assault on God and his realm yet. This is total defiance and opposition to the Creator. Now, with all of our innovation in the modern world, planes and skyscrapers and tanks and smartphones and social media and artificial intelligence and telescopes and brain surgery and rocket ships and space stations, so often we may not say it out loud like this, but we look at what we have made and we say, let us make a name for ourselves. Perhaps one of the worst modern fears is that we will die anonymously that people will not know us and glorify us. I was just thinking about this. There's a movie that came out, I want to say about 8 or 9 years ago, called Whiplash. It starred J.K. Simmons. Is that right? I'm looking at our other cinephile over here. And, what is his name? Oh, he was in the new Top Gun movie. He played Goose's son. Do you know who I'm talking about? Miles Teller. Thank you. I knew I could trust the other. Miles Teller he wants to be a jazz drummer. Have you seen this movie? Okay. May ruin it a little bit for you. But he is working at some conservatory in New York, and he wants to be the world's greatest jazz drummer. And this whole movie, it just shows him, playing drums till his hands bleed. And his mentor is this guy, this J.K. Simmons, who has pushed every student he's ever had so hard that some of them go insane and end up, dying, committing suicide because they feel like they're not great enough. But he is looking for the next genius. And so this guy is at a very crucial point in his career. He's a great drummer, but he's not the best. And so he's been pushed out, kicked out of, and the only way he can ascend to those heights of power is if he just pushes out all the goodness in his life and all kind of sells his soul to the devil of this guy. And the end of the movie is this tragedy where he comes out on the stage where they're already playing. He replaces the other drummer and he just improvises a drum solo that's the most incredible thing you've ever seen or heard. And his father stands there watching as he's watching his son transcend to a new level. And you realize the tragedy of the story is that this man has made a name for himself. He's the greatest drummer that will ever live. And yet he's lost every relationship and it's compromised every ethical value he's had. It's a great movie. I recommend watching it. But that is the world in which we live. If we can't get that kind of notoriety and fame, what is this all for? That is the number one ethos of our young people today, to be famous or die trying. And that is the Babylonian spirit that is not just here in America, but is encased the world right now. And so, we want to immortalize and deify our own image. But to them and to us, here's God's response. Let's look at verse 5. Then the Lord came down to look over the city and the tower that the humans were building. Now the imagery here is supposed to be ironic and a little acerbic. It's supposed to be funny. The Lord stooped down and bent his knees and squinted hard at this little tower the human beings were making. So here, from their perspective, is the greatest feat of civil engineering, or rather just regular engineering, that's ever been done. And for God to even see it, he has to get down real close to the earth to look at it. It's like an elephant standing over a 3-inch anthill. After all, Isaiah says in chapter 40 of his book, he says, God is enthroned above the circle of the earth. Its inhabitants are like grasshoppers. Or as one theologian put it, Yahweh must draw near here, not because he's nearsighted, but because he dwells at such a tremendous height and their work is so tiny. Everything we could ever possibly do, I don't care if you're Joseph Stalin or Kim Jong-un or Attila the Hun or Genghis Khan, is so tiny in comparison to God's glory that if we could really fathom it, we would abandon all hope of ever deifying ourselves. And so David agrees with all of this assessment in Psalm 2. He says, the one who's enthroned in the heavens laughs. The Lord ridicules the nations. But his assessment of them is deadly serious, although he laughs at their attempt. Verse 6, the Lord said, if they have begun to do this as one people, all having the same language, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. That's a scary assessment, I think. Now, is the Lord trying to say here that if he doesn't stop these proto-Babylonians now, that they'll overwhelm him one day? Absolutely not. In a similar way, I think, to Genesis 6, I think the Lord is sick to his stomach, metaphorically speaking, of course, as he looks at their collective power and their ingenuity to accomplish it and sees that they're going to use it only for evil and ultimately their own damnation. He sees this ingenious creation of his, humanity, and it breaks his heart that this is what they use his own divine spark to do. And if he doesn't intervene, their next project, although just as doomed for failure and will never topple the Lord, it'll be an exponential, an astronomical further shift away from his presence and into an everlasting hell. And so, out of great mercy and grace, and I think compassion, the Lord's solution undoes one of their most human abilities, and that is to understand speech. I don't know about you, but if you've ever tried to work with somebody and you're speaking the same language, but they're trying to tell you to do something and you don't understand what they're meaning by that, no work will get done. It's just impossible. In order for people to work together, for organizations, for builders, for engineers, for the military, for the economy, for anything, for people in hospitals or schools or wherever, there needs to be organization and communication. Otherwise, it'll fail. And so the Lord takes that one little Jenga block at the bottom of their tower, that is being able to understand each other, and it all comes falling down. And so here's another poetic irony. In verse 7, the Lord mirrors the Babylonians, but inverts their speech. They say, come, let's make a name for ourselves. And he says, well, first of all, he said, come, let's go down. They say, come, let's come together and build up. He says, come, let's go down. And confuse their language, not work together to build a tower. And so that's what he did. Verse 8, so from there the Lord scattered them throughout the earth, and they stopped building the city. Now Hughes points out again that Moses leaves out the historic details, the ones that we want to know. Well, what does this mean about them not being able to understand each other? Was the confusion of language that God just sent some sort of judgment where they could hear one another's language, but they couldn't apprehend the words? And so, because there's too much miscommunication, they're frustrated and quit? Is that what's happening? Or is it like that they wake up one morning and it's like they're in the middle of a foreign movie and no subtitles are provided? We don't know exactly what happens. In any event, or no matter what happens, the thing that they feared most, that they would be scattered and their name would not be great, falls upon them. And they're scattered all over the earth, and we never will know a single one of their names. And the epilogue in verse 9 to their failed rebellion tells us that this place, now the Hebrew renders the word Babel as Babili, which means the gate of God. So Babylon is the people of the gate of God. So really, that sounds very, Lord of the Rings. It sounds like, a big, serious thing. Well, Moses renders the word not as Babili here, but as Balal, which just means confusion or babble. So, conveniently for us, the word Babel in English, and I should have looked into this, I didn't think about it, where its etymology. The word babble for us means to just speak nonsense. And that's what happens. At Babel, they start to babble. That's the wordplay that's going on here. And so what seems to be the worst judgment imaginable from their assessment actually turns out that it's brimming with grace. Because when God upsets the plans of the wicked, he allows for them to not move so far into condemnation, but maybe even move closer towards him in grace and according to his original design. So sometimes when things go catastrophically in our life, when we are deeply embedded in sin, That's when God is rescuing us out of the sin that's trying to drag us down into the pits of hell with it. Now, just as a bit of reflection on this before we get to our just final few verses, and since it's a genealogy, I promise it'll go quick. Now, the confusion of Babel ought to be something that we are extremely careful with understanding. It ought to give us great pause about how we too engage in the systems and tools and schemes of our society and of our world. If there's anything that's become clear to me, I think, in these last few years, is that things that are supposed to unite us and our common humanity are oftentimes the things that warp and divide us the fiercest. Nowhere does this seem more prominent or pronounced than in modern media like television and social media. It's amazing. I mean, television's, it's been out for 70 years now or something, not even a full century. And think of how our world has been so shaped and changed by the advent of this magical technology where you can see images of photorealistic of other people of any time and place instantly on the other side of the globe. I mean, it is like witchcraft, practically. I mean, when you think about it. How it all works, technically speaking, I don't know. But that started to influence people. People, we're all watching the same things. I mean, it became the thing around which we centered ourselves. Modern living rooms are designed around, to an audience experience of a television. That's where we find, that's our seeing stone in the future. And now we've got these little blasted things in our pockets that we take everywhere with us. That is a portal to worlds unknown. And most of the worlds that are on this thing are just dens of iniquity. Facebook is probably the chief amongst them. Think of how much division and hatred and evil and animosity and scheming and wickedness we've built with an iPhone, with a Babel phone. Christians, more than any other people, need to see that the world we're swimming in is one of purposeful, intentional confusion. We are inundated by all sides, not just Fox News, not just CNN, not just Twitter, not just Facebook, not just Instagram or Snapchat or TikTok or whatever. We are inundated on all sides by untrue and confusing words that have driven us to the point of madness, to where we become radically hateful towards people we have no idea about. I mean, it's true. It behooves us as Christians to not be a people who live in that Babylonian spirit, to not build up these empires, neither of church tribe or ideology. Now, don't misunderstand me. Church doctrine and discipline and devotion are all good things, but Christians are really bad too about separating into their little tribes of people, to where a guy like, a well-loved evangelical statesman in a way, like Tim Keller, can die, which was a tragic thing we heard about this week. And social media is filled with discourse with Christian people saying, well, I doubt he's in heaven, or he was a false teacher, instead of even having the human decency to say, I'll pray for his family. And I mean, that's what we've turned into, to where if you did that 100 years ago, even if the town scumbag died, nobody would in their right mind go into the public forum and say, well, I think he was a real wretch and I mean, it's just inhuman. And it's what we're being formed by day in and day out. The Babylonian heart still beats in society, and if Christians aren't careful, we'll let it start beating in here, where the Spirit of the Lord ought to be. So, word of warning. Now, let's conclude our time together. This brings us to our final section, which is another toledot, which is that Hebrew word about genealogical record, and it starts with Shem. Shem, again, is the one that Noah blesses instead of Ham, and the one whom Noah prophesies would be blessed because he followed the Lord. His God was Yahweh, and that's why Shem is blessed. Not because of Shem, because his God is Yahweh. And so our messianic hopes have been dashed time and again. Seth has failed us, Noah has failed us, and we're about to see that Shem, even though we don't get any record of any wrongdoing or sin that he's done, he also dies and leaves us unfulfilled. And so the Adamic line, although it's continuing, is still not resolved. Now, I don't want to read through this whole thing again, and I sure as heck know you don't want me to. So let me just give a few interesting, at least to me, things to notice. First, notice that the lifespan after the flood, where God said he would start to remove his spirit from mankind so that they wouldn't live too long and do more and more evil things, like at Babel, that's coming to fruition. So, 5-6 chapters ago, he says, I'm removing my spirit from them. I'm removing the breath of life, because if they live 1,000 years, that'll be 1,000 years of idolatry and injustice. And I'm not going to inflict that on them. And so we see the countdown begin. They cap out at, 120 max is the years that the Lord presents us. Well, look at some of the dates or some of the years we get. Well, Shem is at 500, and then his son is at 400, and a few generations later, Eber, who is from where we get the name Hebrew from, well, he's up to 430, but then his son, Peleg, is less than half of that, 209. And so the life expectancy for the first time in human history is just going off the side of a cliff. And the count continues to go down until we get to Nahor. And he dies at 119, the first man to not live to even the expected age that God gives in the Bible. And then we read about a man after him, one named Terah, that lives for at least 70 years when he has his children. Now again, I think that number 70 is supposed to key us up. Okay, some interesting is going to happen with this Terah. Terah, like Noah, has 3 sons. Nahor, Haran, and who? Abram, the 10th generation of Shem. So we all know that Abram, through Abram, the rest of human history begins to really unfold. Today, in the world today, people that draw their either physical lineage or spiritual lineage to Abram is over 4 billion people. Over half the planet connects their life and belief to this man that existed thousands of years ago. Abram is the most crucial historic figure, probably until Jesus Christ himself, honestly. And so, but we notice some ironic things. It's Abram who God draws to be his chosen man and chosen family, and he draws them out of the heart of Babylon. Abram is in Ur of the Chaldees. That's another way of saying he's kind of where the Medians and the Persians would one day live. That's a little editorial note. And he comes out of the heart of wickedness. And yet through him comes the sacred heart of Jesus Christ into the world. In verses 27 through 32, we get a little bit more background on Abram's family. Haran, who is Abram's brother, died before his father. The second man in biblical history to ever do that. Abel died before his father, Adam, but this man presumably died of natural causes. So sin has gotten so bad, sin is now out there murdering people just by, just whittling their life away to nothing. And so out of the land of Ur, of the Chaldeans, where this family is, we meet Abram. And in verse 29, we learn that he takes a wife named Sarai. And then we get another pattern that's set up for the rest of the story of Genesis and the rest of the Old Testament and even on into the New Testament. We learn that Sarai is unable to conceive and could not have a child. So that's, if we were to start Genesis chapter 12 next week, which don't panic, we're not. If we were to start it next week, this would be a new pattern that we would trace, because Rebekah and Rachel at some point are also barren until the Lord intervenes. The mothers of Samson and Samuel, the great judge and prophet of Israel, are barren until their mothers are blessed by the Lord and they conceive. But then we learn that Terah takes his son Abram and Haran's son Lot, another character that we'll figure in, and they leave Ur. They leave the heart of Babylon. And this tiny inbred family, and you'll know why I say inbred in just a moment, of moon worshippers, by the way. That's most likely what they were if they were to come from that region where they were, I think Naaman is the name of the moon goddess that they were worshiping. They leave and they go to Canaan. Now, strangely, in the next chapter, we learn that Abram was called by the Lord when he was in Ur. Well, that's actually in chapter 15. But in chapter 12, we learn that he's again prompted to go out of the land of Ur, to leave the heart of Babylon and go to the promised land. But here we read that Terah is the one that gets his people up and going. And so what's going on here? Why does it say here that Terah is the one that moves them and later that Abram was the one that was called? I think that Terah wanted to go in verse 31 because Abram had already been called there. And it's not until chapters 12 and 15 that we find out this detail as sort of a dramatic effect. You know, the Bible does that. If you watch a good movie and it's set at some point in the future, and that's the first 10 minutes you see in the movie, and all of a sudden it jumps back 50 years for the next 10 minutes, and it gives you a little bit more context, you say, oh, this is a cleverly crafted movie. Because it's not telling things chronologically, but thematically. So that's what's happening here. The Bible's being told thematically, dramatically, theologically. And so for dramatic effect, we find out that Terah was really, I think, moved to go to Canaan because Abram was. That's why only Abram goes, and then young Lot, and not the other brother Nahor, because he doesn't feel called in any way, is my suspicion. And then we also learn later that Terah's daughter-in-law, we read here, Sarai, in chapter 20, is actually his daughter because she is half-sister of Abram. Again, that's for another dramatic reveal where we, like Pharaoh, don't know that about Sarah until he brings her into his court to consummate with her. And then judgment starts to happen. And Pharaoh and we are surprised that here's this new side of the story. Again, the Bible is so good about doing that. But on the way, Terah dies at 205 years old in Haran. Not to be confused with the name of his son. It's another city where they probably worship the moon, and it's probably the city that he named his son Haran after. But regardless, Abram settles there. So Abram is called to go to God's place, to go back into this new garden, the promised land, but he gets halfway there and his heart peters out, and he stays there. And in the next chapter, we learn he's 75 years old, but he's at the beginning of a totally new and surprising story, a surprising chapter in human history, where God may have scattered the human family for their sins to the edges of the world, but he will rest on this one man's family, so that through Abram and his seed, namely Jesus of Nazareth, humanity will be made one and new again. Well, I just want to conclude with just a final thought here. You know that next Sunday, we're Baptists, so we don't hold too closely to the sort of classical lectionary calendar. But next Sunday is Pentecost Sunday. Now that's the day that the church remembers that after Jesus was raised on Easter, that's a holiday we celebrate, and he ascended into heaven 40 days later. That was commemorated this past Thursday. It was 40 days after Easter. Well, then several days after that, by the way, 7 times 7 is the number of the Feast of Pentecost, by the way. Isn't that an interesting detail? So Pentecost is celebrated on the 49th into the 50th day. So 7 times 7 after that, Jesus, after he resurrects, he brings completion to the world by sending his Spirit to fill and empower believers from the lineage of Abram to go out and preach the gospel in their own language so that the people from the 70 nations mentioned in Genesis 10 could hear and understand the good news that Jesus, the son of Abraham and the second Adam, was king and he was coming back to make all things new. Pentecost next week is a commemoration of how God reverses Babel. That's the amazing thing. The city is a mark of human sinfulness. God never intended in his own plan for the city to be what it is. It is something that he capitulated to out of his great mercy and love. Now here's the amazing thing. At the end of all history, the garden is made new. But it's not just a garden, it's a garden city. God redeems even the worst thing that human beings can possibly do for his glory and for their good. And so here's the beauty of the story of Babel. No matter what idolatry or injustice we may have lived out in this life, the Lord will still make all things right and make all things new. You think that you have doglegged off the road of life and into the woods of no return, and you'll find out that once you're in those woods that God was already there awaiting you, ahead of you. And so the Spirit descends from heaven to unite us across languages and nations and cultures and ethnicities, and a new humanity is made, not through Abram, not through Babel, but through Jesus, who is the new human being, and who is, ironically, the new tower between heaven and earth. Jesus is the one that connects us to God's realm, and he brings God's realm down to our realm. And so, as we conclude our study of the patterns and poetry of Genesis, and we've only skimmed and scratched the surface, what more poetic way to conclude than to anticipate not only Pentecost, coming next Sunday, but his second coming, whenever that may be. When the Spirit that started to reverse the curse of sin in Jerusalem all those years ago will come to fruition in the future, where Jesus will be declared king over a new humanity despite all our differences and diversity, and will retain those things. The Revelation says the kings of the earth will stream into New Jerusalem. They won't lose the color of their skin. They won't lose their cultural background or languages. They'll just be united despite those differences. We may be different, and we may be struggling in the wake of a Babylonian empire, but we are made one together in the Lord Jesus Christ. And it's at that time that our new story will start. And when we step into heaven, all of us together for the first time, we won't just hear, in the beginning, God created. No, we'll hear, in the beginning of a new beginning, God resurrected the heavens and the earth. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your scriptures. We thank you for the powerful truth that we find in them. We thank you for the compelling story that you've left through us, through literature. We thank you for those scholars, church fathers and mothers who have given their lives and limb to make sure that this could be translated into a language of our heart, that we could understand these ancient stories as modern day truths for us in this contemporary world. Lord, help us to trust these things, and help us in all things to look to Jesus, who is the new Adam. He is the fulfillment of the promise of God to Abraham. Let us look to Jesus, the founder and the perfecter of our faith. For it's in his name we pray all these things. Amen.